If you're looking to bid for the Tactical Communication Systems Framework, you've downloaded the tender pack, all 71 documents, and you're now sat there thinking, right, where on earth do I even start? First of all, totally normal, and this video is exactly for people in that moment. So what I usually help suppliers with at this stage isn't just understanding what the documents are, but working out which ones actually matter right now, which ones are background reading, and where your time is best spent, because that's where things can quickly spiral out of control. So you've got your call-off schedules, framework schedules, joint schedules, attachments, but once you understand what each group of documents is doing, it all starts to click and suddenly the pack can feel more manageable rather than overwhelming. So let's take a look. So let's look at the big picture first. When a framework tender like TacSys lands, you're not being given one contract. You're being given a bundle of documents, all with different jobs to do. Some explain the rules, some form the legal contract, and some are there purely for you to complete as part of your bid. Now the problem is they all arrive at the same time, and that's usually where people get stuck. Part of the support I give is helping you separate those roles out early, so you're not trying to treat every document with the same urgency. Once you see the structure, it does start to make sense, so let's break it down. Framework schedules. Now these are the core framework rules. They explain things like how the framework operates or how call-offs will be run later on, a call-off being the point where a buyer actually buys something through that framework. What buyers and suppliers can and can't do, how long the framework lasts, or simply be a template or explain a particular procedure. Now at tender stage, this is about understanding what you're signing up to. You don't live in these documents day to day, but you do need to be comfortable with them. And this is often where I help suppliers sense check risk, flagging anything that's standard, anything that's unusual, and anything that needs a proper conversation before you submit. Now, once you're on contract, these sit quietly in the background until there's a can we, can't we moment. General terms and framework award form. Firstly, these are two separate things, so I'm going to split them into two. The general terms, well, they're the legal backbone. Things like liability, payment, termination, data protection, IP or intellectual property, all the stuff that lawyers care deeply about, and for good reason. At tender stage, you're checking for risk. Can you live with these terms? Are there any red flags? And once you're on contract, these suddenly become very real if something goes wrong. So lawyers love these documents. Now the framework award form is simpler. Think of it as the official handshake. It summarises the main features of the framework contract, things like the fact that you've been awarded, placed on the framework, which lots you're on, when it starts, who the parties are, key dates, the order procedure, all that kind of stuff. You don't complete it at tender stage, it's issued if you're successful. And once it's issued, that's your proof that you're on the framework. Call-off schedules. Now these are used when a buyer actually wants to buy something through the framework. They include things like the specific requirements, delivery details, timelines and all that kind of stuff. At tender stage, you're usually just reading examples so you understand how work will be awarded later. Once on contract, these become the contract for that specific piece of work. Joint schedules. Now, joint schedules are standard contract schedules that a buyer or organisation like CCS uses again and again across different frameworks. Instead of rewriting the same rules every time, they create one set of joint schedules and just plug them into lots of different frameworks. So these will apply across multiple frameworks, not just one. And they usually cover things like definitions, information assurance, transparency, and governance. Now at tender stage, you need to make sure you understand what's in them and how they apply to your business, and make sure that nothing conflicts with how you operate. You need to be comfortable, again, with what you're signing up to. Now, if you already work in the public sector, you'll probably recognise a lot of the content, and that familiarity can help you sense check things more quickly. But it's still about confirming that nothing in there conflicts with how you operate or what you're offering under the framework. Once you're on contract, they quietly apply to everything you do under the framework. Attachments. Now these are usually the practical working documents, things like questionnaires, pricing templates, technical responses and compliance tables. And this is where I spend most of my time helping clients. I help them with structuring answers, checking alignment, sense checking their compliance and making sure that what you submit stands up when it later becomes contractual. Now at tender stage, these are the ones you actively complete and upload. So it's where you're going to spend most of your time and headspace. On contract, some attachments will still matter, and I'm going to cover that in a moment, but then there are others that will purely be tender only and never touched again. Framework Schedule 2. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this one schedule specifically as it is kind of important. Schedule 2 often causes a wobble the first time people open it because it's basically blank, apart from saying something like insert supplier framework tender response. Let me reassure you, there's nothing missing, it's just a placeholder. What it could really say is everything you submit as part of your tender will eventually live here. Because once the framework is awarded, the buyer takes your written responses, pricing, technical submissions, etc., and locks them into the contract by placing them as part of Schedule 2. And this is why wording matters so much at tender stage. What feels like just a bid answer now becomes, this is how we must deliver it later. And I often explain this using the old school lever arch file example. Bear with me. Imagine everything is printed, and for every framework agreement that is awarded, the buyer has a big lever arch file with dividers labelled Schedule 1, Schedule 2, Schedule 3, and so on. Behind each divider, they'd print and place the relevant documents. Now, when they get to the Schedule 2 divider, they'd print your entire tender response and file it in there. And that's how your tender becomes part of the contract. From this, you can see why there are so many documents, because being awarded a place on a framework, it doesn't mean you get one contract document. It means you're signing up to a set of documents that together form the contract. What makes up the framework contract? Once you're awarded, the contract will be made up of the framework award form. This switches the contract on and it confirms you're on the framework and which lots apply. The framework schedules. These are the rules of the framework which apply to everyone. The joint schedules, and these are the shared standard conditions that sit across various frameworks and tenders. General terms, that's the legal stuff. Schedule 2, that's your tender response locked in now as a contractual commitment. And all of those together are what will form the framework contract. Now you'll notice I haven't mentioned call-off schedules yet, and that's because they sit underneath everything else. They only come into play when a buyer is ready to buy something, and then they can add the detail for that specific requirement, things like scope, pricing, timelines and delivery, and each call-off creates its own contract. But it always sits under and is governed by the framework contract. And that's why call-offs usually include wording along the lines of, in the event of conflict, the call-off takes precedence, because both the framework contract and the call-off contract are legally binding. They just operate at different levels. So in simple terms, the framework contract sets the rules, the call-off schedules create the actual job-specific contract underneath it. Where do I start? Now, I get asked this a lot, but a good place to begin is with the attachments, believe it or not, because these are the practical working documents. So find those and start at the top with attachment 1. Now, in this case with TacSys, the buyer has been really helpful. In paragraph 2.3, they're very clear about the reading order and say, attachment 1 together with attachment 2 should be read first. However, you must read all the additional attachments and the framework contract documents, which can be found within the e-sourcing tool. They then build on that in paragraph 2.4, which says, paragraph 8 of attachment 2, that's the how-to tender document, sets out the associated tender documents and provides further instructions on the completion requirements. Now that section is a really useful checkpoint. It helps you make sure you're approaching each document in the right way and not missing anything important along the way. You'll notice though, right at the bottom of the table, there's a reference to attachment 6, but there isn't a separate attachment 6 in the document set. And that's because attachment 6 is made up of the general terms, schedules, framework schedules, joint schedules, call-off schedules, and the framework award form. Going back to the old school example of printing everything and putting it in a lever arch file, the first lever arch file would be created by you, the supplier, and that one is purely for tendering. You'd print the tender pack and organise it behind subject dividers labelled attachment 1, attachment 2, attachment 3, and so on. And behind the divider for attachment 6, you'd file printed copies of all the schedules and contract documents just for reference while you're completing the tender. And if your tender is successful, a second separate lever arch file is created by the buyer. And this then becomes the contract file. And it contains all the schedules that make up the framework contract, with your completed tender filed behind Schedule 2. So it then can be referred to while the contract is being delivered. Now, before I wrap this up, there's one final thing that's really important to understand with frameworks, and that is that the contract doesn't suddenly start when you win a call-off. It actually starts when you're awarded a place on the framework. From that point, you already have a live contract, and you're already bound by what you wrote in your tender. You just don't have any work yet. And that's why the schedules aren't just admin or background paperwork. They set the rules, they capture your commitments, and they define what you've agreed to deliver. And Schedule 2 is the one that will turn into this is how we would deliver into this is how we must deliver. So that's the TacSys document pack explained. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, I get it, but I would really like someone to sanity check this with me, that's exactly where I help. Whether it's sense checking the documents, reviewing what you've drafted, or helping you prioritise what exactly needs your attention, you don't have to figure this out on your own. Good luck with your submission, and if you need a hand, you can always find me at thetendercoach.com.